It is now my pleasure to introduce our commencement speaker, a man who knows what it's like to handle uncertainty and make something understandable. Nate Silver is the founder and editor-in-chief of the website 538, an innovative place where datasets and analytical methods are shared with the public. Silver works with data and numbers, but thinks about more than just quantitative information. He takes all of this science and applies it to things people are very passionate about, making it digestible, relevant, and interesting. Silver attended the University of Chicago and has received a plethora of honorary degrees. After today, Wikipedia can add Kenyon to that list. Silver also happens to be a New York Times best-selling author, one of Time's 100 most influential people, and a great follow on Twitter. Please join me now in welcoming today's commencement speaker, Nate Silver.
Good morning, everyone. I'm reading my remarks from my phone, so I'm not being rude by checking my email or something. I just want you to know. But thank you, Eliza. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, President Decatur, and for the whole Kenyon College community to invite me to be a part of your day. It's a really big honor. It's wonderful to have the chance to speak with you, and it's something I'll always cherish. But more importantly, congratulations to the 420 of you who are graduating today. This is your day, and it's also a day that, like, my graduation was a whirlwind. I barely even remember it, but this is like one of the few days in your life where you wake up in one chapter of your life, and by the time you go to bed, it's a whole different chapter. That's pretty rare and pretty special. Before I get into the core of my talk, I want to start with one fairly general piece of advice based on my own experience. I graduated from University of Chicago 18 years ago, which has some commonalities with Kenyon. It's also a liberal arts institution. It's also in a much bigger city than Gambier, I would say. I'm also wary. I know a lot of commencement addresses suffer from the problem of like drawing conclusions from a sample size of one. As a statistician, that bothers me quite a bit. But I did just turn 40 this year, which is the age at which you're officially allowed to pass off anecdotal evidence as wisdom, quote unquote. The advice, though, was also drawn from the knowledge that this is going to be a fairly abrupt transition for a lot of you. Kenyon College is a small, tight-knit community, but statistically not very many of you are going to be staying in Gambier after college. Most of you will probably be out of here by tonight, frankly. So you're going to make new friends. You're going to lose touch with friends. You're going to start a job. You're going to maybe have more responsibility in some ways than you had before and more freedom than you had before and be more responsible. It's a lot happening all at once, and at a time like that, it's easy to feel disconnected and untethered, and it might be a harder transition, frankly, than you realize. It will be hard to find the right balance between, on the one hand, experimenting with your personal and professional identity, and on the other hand, staying true to yourself and your values. So my advice is simply don't let yourself get stuck. Don't let yourself get stuck in a career or a life situation that's neither A, where you want to be right now, or B, something that puts you on a path toward being where you want to be later on in life. And by the way, a lot more of you will be in category B than category A. You're not going to get your dream job right out of college. It will take a lot of hard work. But if you don't think you're on the right path, take advantage of the fact that you're relatively untethered, that you have relatively few commitments, that you're flexible, and be willing to shift gears pretty quickly. I can speak from experience in saying the downside to having a career that you don't derive fulfillment from is really far down, and the upside to having a career that you like, not to say there aren't hard days at the office still, but the upside's really far up. I mean, you're spending probably half your life working, if not more in some capacity. That's a big deal. It's easy to not think about it at a moment like this. It's easy to kind of caught up in the whirlwind of the summer and whatnot, but make sure you're looking after your career development. As for me, I started out doing something called transfer pricing consulting, which is about as exciting as it sounds. Eventually, I quit that job to, of all things, play poker. That got omitted from the official biography, and develop systems to predict how Major League Baseball players would perform. I can see your parents are a little bit terrified by this advice right now. The point is not to follow my career path, but to be willing to continue pivoting. You know, in my case, I was able to grow 538 from a site that was just me starting a blog and what I thought was my spare time to a newsroom that now employs 35 people. If I were graduating from college right now, then it's possible my path would have been a little bit more straightforward. There are lots and lots of careers now in quote-unquote data science, a term that didn't really even exist when I graduated. There are careers in data journalism, which is a term we use to describe what 538 does. There are even several hundred jobs of people who work for professional sports teams as statistical analysts, which is not a ton, but it's a lot more than when I graduated, when there were probably like 2 people doing that in the entire United States. So back when I graduated, people using data and statistics in fields like sports and politics and journalism were really on the outside looking in. There was a rebellious spirit. We questioned authority. We wanted to shake things up. We were critical of what we saw as lazy, complacent, self-serving decision-making by established companies and institutions. We thought these institutions did not want to engage in statistical analysis or any other type of analysis because it might demonstrate to them that their conventional wisdom was wrong and they weren't actually thinking very deeply about what they were doing. Nowadays, it's a very different ball game. Everyone is using data. 3 out of the 4 teams that are still alive in the NBA playoffs, the Rockets, the Celtics, and the Warriors, are extremely proficient with using data. The 4th one is the Cavaliers, and they have LeBron James. So to succeed in the NBA now, you either need LeBron or to have a good analytics department, I think is the lesson there. Of course, there are lots of questions about how people are using data. We'll get to that in a moment. But for better or worse, it's no longer really acceptable to claim that you don't care about being data-driven. Even President Trump gives lip service to this. In a tweet last year, he said, "I call my own shots largely based on an accumulation of data, and everyone knows it," exclamation point last year. The flip side of this, though, is that the nerds, so-called, are no longer on the outside looking in. Instead, they're often running companies. Power has shifted toward people in companies and businesses and governments that have a lot of proficiency in data science. I obviously don't think this is entirely a bad thing, but it's by no means entirely a good thing either, because you should inherently harbor some suspicion of big, powerful institutions and their potentially self-serving and short-sighted motivations. People who are capable of using data in powerful ways are also capable of abusing data in powerful ways. What worries me the most, especially at companies like Facebook and other Silicon Valley behemoths, is the idea that using data science allows one to remove human judgment from the equation. That's not true. For example, in a post announcing a recent change to Facebook's newsfeed algorithm, Mark Zuckerberg claimed that Facebook was not comfortable trying to come up with a way to determine which news sources were most trustworthy. Instead, they would have people vote to decide which news organization you can trust and which you can't. Maybe it's a good way to do it, and maybe it's not, but what bothers me is the idea that Facebook can outsource responsibility for its algorithm to readers instead of itself, instead of to its engineers. I also get worried when I hear people overuse terms like artificial intelligence and machine learning instead of simpler terms like computer programming. Phrases like that, like machine learning, can appeal to people's notion of a push-button solution, meaning the idea is that you press a button on the machine and the computer does all the thinking for you. There's no kind of human judgment required. That's a dangerous idea. The reality is that working with data requires lots of judgment. First, it requires critical judgment and experience in drawing inferences from data. And second, it requires moral judgment in establishing what your goals are and what the boundaries are for your work. So let's talk first about that first type of judgment, critical judgment. The more experience you have in working with different types of data sets, especially for the big important problems that we all want to solve, the more you realize that the correct answer is rarely obvious, and the obvious seeming answer is not always correct. Sometimes, in fact, changing a single assumption can radically change your conclusion. In the 2016 US presidential election, there were a host of models that all used the exact same data, the exact same inputs pretty much. They range from giving Trump about a 1 in 3 chance based on the polls, which was our model, to a 1 in 100 chance. Those are really different answers. And if you look at fields like psychology, there's something known as the replication crisis, which is the idea that something like 60% of findings in peer-reviewed academic journals cannot be replicated when other researchers attempt to duplicate them. Changing just one small detail in an experiment, or even trying to exactly recreate the same experiment, can make a highly statistically significant result disappear. I want to be clear before I go further that I'm not saying that there's no such thing as objective evidence. I'm not a postmodernist. I'm not one who says that truth is merely socially constructed, although it is socially mediated. But the goal of a statistical model should be to describe the real world, and if the real world is a complicated place, then the model will be complicated too, and it will frequently be wrong. Data science also requires moral judgment. Once you gather a certain type of information, it's extremely hard to contain it. It can be hacked, it can be sold, it can be commandeered by the government. A company that once had benign intentions can decide that maybe it does want to be a little bit evil after all, potentially. The moral issues are even more profound when they apply to questions of how different groups of people are treated. For instance, a lot of supposedly objective, data-driven ways to determine criminal sentences actually can reinforce racial bias based on which variables are encoded into the data. There's also judgment required in knowing what type of problem you're trying to solve. So to turn back to Facebook, one reason they've had so much trouble figuring out what type of news content to serve to people is because they at various points have lots of conflicting objectives. They say, we want news that's trustworthy, we want news that's relevant, whatever that means. We want news that promotes meaningful social interactions, and they want news that maximizes engagement. Those are all different and not necessarily highly compatible goals. If you settled on one of those, you might be able to design an algorithm to optimize as best as you can for that. But if you don't have clear goals in mind, it doesn't matter how good your algorithm is, you don't have a solvable problem to address in the first place. You're going to have a mess on your hands. So where does that leave us? Well, the bad news is that these are really hard problems. We've gone from a world where people kind of ignore data to where people are trying to use it and realizing actually it's way harder than you might think. The good news is that mere moments from now, you will all be presented with a degree from Kenyon College, and what I hope is a capstone to an amazing 4 years that you've had here. I'm a huge believer in a liberal arts education because the goal is really to develop critical thinking skills, and you will forget, frankly, a great deal of what you learned in the past 4 years here, but those critical thinking skills really will stay with you for the rest of your life, and they're extremely valuable. So if you're pursuing a career in a statistics-related field, which I hope some of you will, I hope you'll use that Kenyon education to combine good data science with good judgment, and I hope you remember that statistics are important to the extent they help us describe, understand, maybe even predict the real world. They're not that exciting unto themselves. They need to have purposeful engagement instead. If you're not undertaking a career in data science, I hope you'll nevertheless develop and maintain enough knowledge about statistics to be a well-informed citizen and to scrutinize claims by powerful companies and politicians and governments when they invoke statistics. I hope that you'll remain well-informed and realize that data science does not have to be opposed to other ways of looking at the world. Either way, most of you will feel like you're starting out your careers on the outside looking in. That was how I felt 18 years ago. And yet, many of you will become very successful over time. You'll become powerful. You'll become part of big institutions. You'll become part of the establishment, so to speak. When that happens, I hope that you will not stop thinking critically. Don't stop questioning the data. Don't stop questioning authority. And don't stop questioning yourself. Thank you, students, and congratulations.